Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. It's time to talk gardening. And are you ready to talk mulch today? We'll be talking everything about mulch. Mulch for new gardeners, mulch for experienced gardeners, and it'll be a good primer and refresher for many of us. Nice to see you all here today. Bonsoir to Jean-Pierre and all of our friends from Belgium. I want to give a shout out to James Richter. Thank you for that contribution to start our Monday. Thank you so much. Hello to you in Minnesota. And this has already garnered a question. So let's talk about hardiness zones real briefly, because James mentions being in 4B in Minnesota. I'm in 5B here in Colorado. And often we just throw those terms around as though everybody understands them. And when we get into the mulch, I'll talk about that as well. We have things in gardening that many of us know and many others don't. And especially in a global community, there are some of these terms that are lost on others. So Luke is one of our friends from Belgium and is wondering, what's a zone 4B? And that's really a great question, because the hardiness zones were first developed in the 1960s here in the United States by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to identify the average lowest winter temperatures. And so zone 4B means that the average lowest winter temperature is minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about minus 32 degrees Celsius. In my zone 5B garden, the average lowest winter temperature is minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about minus 26 Celsius. And these numbers become important because of the perennials, the trees, the plants that are going to come back the next year. Will they survive our winters? And in the United States, from Alaska to Puerto Rico, we actually cover 12 hardiness zones historically that range from extreme lows to winter temperatures that never get below freezing. And so that's why the system was developed, so that gardeners in particular, plant distributors and nurseries would know if the plants that they were selling and growing would survive a winter in different areas. And so it's helpful for those of us who are in a zone 4 or zone 5 garden, because we can't grow some of the plants that might be grown in Florida or California, because they just won't survive our winters. And now to the question from Luke in Belgium. In Europe, you only have a handful of hardiness zones. Now, they do have a similar system. It's used differently in the United Kingdom. I think there are 3, maybe 4 zones that range from Scotland down to Wales. And then you go over to the continent and you have countries like Belgium that might only have 1 or 2 zones. And so because the weather is so consistent throughout the country in winter, you don't have to worry about the wide variation. And that holds true through most of the continent of Europe. There's very little variation in winter temperatures when you talk about a large region. And so all of the plant distributors, all of the nurseries, all the gardeners are pretty much operating under the same climate and the same low temperatures in winter. We just don't have that in the United States, which is why we've developed this system. The USDA has this system that they monitor, and they update the temperatures typically every 20 or 25 years. And so we are currently operating, and I'm expecting an update soon, but the current guidance we have is based on historical data, usually going back over 30 years of climatological data to identify the average lowest temperatures. I've noticed for the most part my temperatures have been increasing, I'm sure most of you recognize that as well. But this year and last year, we actually had one day in my garden where the temperature got down to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which means that's maintaining the historical average. So though it might change when we update hardiness zones here sometime, I'm guessing within the next 5 to 10 years, you never know. It only takes one day to become the lowest temperature of that winter. And if the average lowest temperature stays pretty consistent, well, then your hardiness zone isn't going to change. But Europe, Australia, and a lot of other areas of the world have the same system in place with zones, but they might only vary by a few degrees. So thanks for that question, Luke, because it really is interesting and highlights that not everybody uses the same type of gardening systems around the world, even though we're all gardeners and we're all trying to garden pretty much the same. And so that brings me to the topic of today, which is mulch. And why am I talking about mulch today? Well, first off, as most of you know that have watched my videos and these live streams, I would say the two topics I discuss most often are soil and mulch. And soil is just such a mystery for so many people. And there's so much science involved that I talk a lot about the science behind soil and why you need to improve your soil and the soil microorganisms. And then I just kind of throw in the importance of mulch in soil health and in the general health of your garden. Well, I got a comment this last week, obviously from a new gardener who had discovered one of my videos. And in that video that was about problems with raised beds, I mentioned mulch as being one of the things I do, and then just moved on. Because for me, I just get into that mode like so many of us do, where you just assume that a gardener knows what you're talking about when we talk about mulch. Her comment or question was, WTF is mulch? And that just kind of blew me away. It's like, oh, yes, there are people out there that don't know what mulch is, and probably more importantly, don't understand completely how to use it and what the benefits are. And so that's why we're talking about this today, because especially for new gardeners who might be stumbling across the Gardener Scott channel, maybe some of you, this is your first live stream, and even though those of you that have been watching for a while, you might not think about mulch as something you need to know more about, but you do. I think mulch is one of the most important things to do in the garden, which is why I mention it in so many of my videos. But I apologize for not spending more time getting into mulch and talking about how to do it, what it is, and how I do it. So that'll be the big topic for today. Paul says the book Taming with Microbes really broke it down for me as far as soil health. And that's one of the books that I recommend. Down in the description below, I have my recommended list of books. And I agree wholeheartedly with you, Paul. Taming with Microbes is a great book that talks about soil and also highlights the importance of mulch and why you want to use it in your garden and how you get into the benefits to the soil from using mulch. And so I did want to give a shout out before I forget to Rick in Australia, where it's 1 a.m. I think that's awesome. And I want to really highlight what you're doing right this moment, because I think it's a good lesson for everybody else. Right now in Australia, it's winter. It's cold. And there isn't a lot of gardening going on by many gardeners. But Rick is up at 1 a.m. to learn more about gardening, to be part of this community. And I love that. And I do a lot of that in winter when I can't actually be out gardening. I watch way more videos and read many more books to keep in that mindset of gardening. So good for you, Rick, that you are still in the gardening mindset, even though winter has entered your garden, and I'm sure things are going to be slowing down. So I think that's awesome. Okay, let's see. Get back. Yeah, there you go. Jay Dixon. Thank you so much for that. Jay and Heidi are the wonderful moderators that help us stay on track. And so you can check out the recommended books, and many others in addition to Teaming with Microbes. Brian saying, I'm using more and more finished and mostly finished compost as mulch. Great idea. And that's actually on my list of things I want to talk about today. So let's go ahead and start with that, because that's a really good way to understand just what mulch is. And so we think of compost as very important for our soil. And I highly encourage that you have a compost pile, make your own compost. And compost is simply organic matter that we put into a box, we put into a bag, we put into a bin, we put into a tumbler, and it decomposes, and we put that in our garden. If we take that compost and we mix it into the soil, it is a soil amendment with the intent of improving the soil. But we can take that same material, the compost, and put it on top of the soil. And when it's on top of the soil, it isn't a soil amendment, it is mulch. And that's the key point to think about when we talk about mulch. Anything we put on top of the soil with intent is a mulch. And so I completely agree with Brian. And I was just thinking about that this morning, not necessarily in relation to this live cast, but what I'm going to be doing this week. And I'm going to be taking some of my rough compost, the compost that isn't fully decomposed yet, and put it on the surface of my beds as a mulch. If I let it break down more and the particles are finer and more decomposed, and at the end of the season I mix it into the soil, well, now it's an amendment. And this is where it can become a bit confusing, because that compost that I'm going to be putting on my beds over the next couple of weeks as a mulch to protect and enrich the soil, at the end of the season, I will turn over the soil so that the mulch now becomes a soil amendment. And so you can see where some of the confusion might arise, particularly with new gardeners, because you can take a soil amendment, use it as a mulch, and then it can become a soil amendment again. So hopefully I haven't confused you too much, but that's exactly what I do in my garden. That's one reason why a lot of the mulches I use are organic and can decompose and improve the soil later in the year. So I use a lot of aged straw that's been sitting around for about a year. I use grass clippings. I use crushed up leaves, or like in the most recent video, now I'll be using those crushed up leaves that came from my leaf mold pile. I use all of that as mulch on top of the soil. And then at the end of the season, in late autumn, I turn it into the soil and just let it sit all through the winter into early spring. And now that mulch will break down in the soil and improve the soil. And as an amendment, I get double use out of that organic material. So we'll talk more about that here as we proceed. I want to go ahead and give a shout out to Marcy Etherington, a new member of the Gardener's God channel. Thank you for signing up, for joining, and be sure and check us out on our Facebook page if you have Facebook, and look for some of those other perks of becoming a member. So thanks, Marcy. I appreciate you being part of the community and joining in that Gardener's God membership. That's awesome. Okay. TJ the Hawk is saying, have you ever found straw to be contaminated with herbicides? I think my tomatoes are showing herbicide damage, and I can't figure out if it's straw or the new compost. So I personally haven't used straw that I suspect has had herbicides in it. So I don't have any personal experience. I have a video on this. I'm sure that Jay will give you a link to it here in just a minute. So I have a video that talks about the herbicides in straw. And that's one reason why I wanted to highlight that the straw I use in my beds as mulch is the straw that I bought a year ago. And it's been sitting out in the rain and the snow and the weather for a year. And I've just started using it in my vegetable garden this year. And one of the big reasons I do that is because if the straw is contaminated by herbicides, most of those chemicals have a half-life of 6 to 9 months. And I talk about that in the video. And so by being weathered, by sitting out for a year, the likelihood of my straw having any herbicide residue is extremely low. And it's becoming more prevalent. Much of it depends on where you live, the source of your straw. In my region, and I've asked this of the livestock stores where I get my straw, nobody really knows if the straw bales have been contaminated with herbicides or not. But it seems, based on what people share with me, that there are some regions where it's a bigger problem than others. I just don't want to run the risk. So I age my straw by letting it sit out, and then I use it. It's possible that your tomatoes could be showing damage. So you can go online and see what herbicide damage looks like. It could be caused by your neighbor spraying an herbicide and it blows into your garden, or it could be caused by the straw. And so it could be a factor. But look at the new growth on the plants in particular. And if the leaves are a little gnarled and begin to become misshapen, yeah, that could be herbicide damage. If you've just started using straw, it's possible that the straw could be a problem. If you suspect the straw, go ahead and remove it. Take it off and put it someplace else. You can use it in months ahead once it's weathered. But if you have any suspicion of contamination with the mulch you're using, remove the mulch. It's as simple as that. And then go to something else, like maybe go crushed leaves or grass clippings or plastic. And so I wanted to talk about that as well. There are two basic types of mulches. There are organic mulches and there are inorganic mulches. So I like the organic mulches, as I just talked about, because I can use an organic mulch and get the benefit of using it as a soil amendment. But you could put plastic sheeting over your beds. That's mulching. You're covering the soil with an intent, and the plastic is an inorganic mulch. You can use stone, gravel. That can also be a very effective mulch. You see that a lot in landscapes, inorganic mulch. The big issue I have with inorganic mulches in a vegetable garden is they don't decompose. You can't turn them into the soil. They're not improving the soil. And when it comes time to plant, you've got to pull it aside to put the plants in or to put your seeds in. So it does have a place in the landscape. I just don't think inorganic mulch necessarily has a place in most of our vegetable gardens. But that being said, having lived in California for a number of years, a lot of the farmers in California use plastic as a mulch. Let's talk about why. So when we use mulches, one of the top reasons, particularly if you're a farmer, is that it cuts down on weeds. If you have a barrier on top of the soil, a mulch, then the weed seeds can't germinate, or if they do germinate, their growth might be hindered. And so by putting a mulch on your beds on top of the soil, you're reducing the number of weeds that you'll have in that bed. Well, it makes sense in commercial farming to do rows and rows of plastic because that cuts down on the weeds entirely. The plastic just kills the weeds and also keeps the weeds underneath from growing. And then they come along and they cut holes in the plastic and put their seeds and or plants in, and they grow their crop. And then at the end of the season, after they've harvested, they rip up all the plastic. Well, that's a whole nother discussion as to how effective that is and what happens with that plastic. But you can do the same thing in your garden. You can put plastic over your soil, cut a hole in it, put your plant in it, and grow. And so if you're worried about or suspect that your mulch is contaminated and you don't have any other options, think about plastic. For many of us who have very hot summers, the plastic can really increase the soil temperature to the point that it might damage the plant and definitely could damage the soil life underneath. So I'm not a big proponent of plastic, but it can be used as a mulch. I like to stay with organic mulches. I like to stay with light mulches that can break down in my vegetable garden. But the rest of my landscape around my fruit trees and my bushes and my perennial flowers, I like to use wood chips or pine needles, pine straw. They break down much more slowly, so I don't have to replace them as often. And I get the same benefits of the mulch, particularly the weed suppression in a lot of those areas. The fruit tree area that I have, I've got about 6 inches of wood chip mulch, and there are no weeds in that area. Around the trees, the mulch is only about 2 to 3 inches deep. And in that area, I've got some weeds because a light mulch, a mulch that's only a couple inches thick, may not be enough to suppress the weeds. Whereas if you're doing it for weed suppression, 6 inches will stop just about everything. Another big reason for mulching, and why I do it in my region in particular, is that it helps hold the soil moisture more consistent. When you're covering the top of the soil, the water can't escape that's in the soil, so it stays moist. You don't need to water as often, and especially around plants like tomatoes that might be susceptible to blossom end rot, which is most often caused by inconsistent watering. Just by mulching your tomatoes, you might be able to eliminate any problems you have with blossom end rot because the soil moisture is able to stabilize and the mulch helps that. Same with the soil temperature. That plastic will warm up the soil in summer, but a mulch like straw can actually cool the soil, or at least keep it from getting so hot. And so mulch becomes a soil temperature moderator, and plants like that. Plants don't like the extremes of the cold and the heat and the cold and the heat. Mulch helps keep the soil much more consistent, and that can be important for the root growth. And then, of course, whether you turn it into the soil or not, an organic mulch will break down over time and can help the soil life underneath. It offers food for beetles and for the fungi that's going to be in your soil to break down that woody material or that thicker material like leaves and straw that you might have on top. Can really help improve soil life. And another big reason that I would put in the top 5 is just that the sun, the UV rays of the sun can damage or kill the soil life in that top layer of soil. And I just think soil life is critical to the importance of our garden. Well, a mulch helps protect the soil from the sun's radiation. So there's a quick list of some of the most important reasons why I mulch and why you might want to consider mulch if you're not doing it. And let's get back to some of the questions that we have. Okay, let's see. Oh, you guys are just so awesome. So Rick's wondering about wood chips versus nitrogen loss. And so in the decomposition process, nitrogen is used by the organisms that are breaking down that material. And so most of the material that we're putting on our garden beds as mulch is high in carbon. And from the knowledge you might have of the composting process, we mix nitrogens and carbons together to generate that decomposition process and get our compost. So if we're using a high carbon mulch on our soil, then there is going to be a need for nitrogen to break down that material. And the nitrogen is most likely going to come from the soil. But the studies I've seen show that it's just a very shallow interface between the mulch and the soil that has that nitrogen depletion. And so it's an inch maybe of your soil at the surface that might have less nitrogen than the soil deeper down. But if you think about it, the roots of our plants that are also needing that nitrogen for the plant growth are growing deeper than that top inch of soil. So even though the mulch might cause a nitrogen depletion close to the surface, it's not causing a nitrogen depletion deeper into the soil. And instead, as a food for those microorganisms are breaking down that mulch, and an earthworm, for example, goes to the surface, takes some of that decaying material, and then tunnels back down into the soil and deposits through the castings that organic material. And it's those castings, the food that the earthworm ate close to the surface, that now actually provides nitrogen to the soil for the roots and for the plants. So it's an entire cycle. The actual soil surface may not have much nitrogen, but deeper down, because you've been mulching, the soil will be improved from that soil organism. And it's not just the earthworms, there are a lot of others that are transferring the nutrients throughout the soil to benefit the plants. So hope that helps a little bit. Okay, Frank's saying, I have little pink flowers like a constellation in the lawn, chives, peppermint, now cut back to the corners, a mower won't fit. So I hope you're thinking about actually using that in your compost pile. And so, or as a mulch, since we're talking about that today. And so if you are mowing your lawn and you've got weeds in your lawn, if you have flowers in your lawn, even if you have mint in your lawn or any other area that you're cutting down, you can put that right on the soil surface as a mulch. As long as you know that it hasn't been sprayed with herbicides that might affect your plants, use it as a mulch right away. The biggest concern that I would caution you about using fresh grass clippings is that they can clump up, and then as they dry, they can create a barrier to water and air on top of the surface. That's why I like to use dried grass clippings. They won't clump up together. But if I mow a lawn and it's got grass clippings and leaves from the weeds, maybe some flowers, maybe some leaves that fell from the tree, I'm not worried about those grass clippings clumping together because they're mixed with all of that other material. And that can actually be an amazing mulch. And when you use a green mulch like that, it's high in nitrogen. So you're not going to have that nitrogen depletion in the beginning close to the soil. It's bringing along its own nitrogen source to begin the decomposition as a mulch. So that's actually one of those things I like to do a lot if I can. Marcia's asking, when you turn compost into the garden at the end of the season, how deep you turn it? Does it break up the soil structure? So I actually have a video where I show how I do that at the end of this last season. I use a garden fork and I just turn it over. And so yes, some of the soil structure will be broken whenever you turn over the soil. But for me, who has poor soil, and I'm working on every year trying to improve the soil to the point that I don't need to turn it anymore, the influx of organic matter to boost the soil life is more important than that breakdown in the soil structure, because all of the soil aggregates, all of the the function of the soil microbes that develop the soil structure, they need food for that to happen. And so by me turning it in, it offers food. And so I only turn it in as deep as I get my garden fork. And so it might be 6 inches, it might be 8 inches. In the corners where it's harder to turn over, it might only be 4 inches. And so it's just taking a big clump that's got the compost or the mulch on top of it and turning it upside down so that now that compost is integrated into the soil at 4 or 6 or 8 inches deep. And then I add more mulch on top. So going into the winter, I continue to mulch. Even when there aren't plants growing, I keep my beds covered, either with the straw, the leaves, and the grass, or as we've talked recently and as I've shown in videos recently, the living crops, the ground covers going into autumn and winter aren't technically a mulch. They're a living mulch, you could say, because they're plants growing and achieving the same benefits of the organic or inorganic mulches that we use. But the soil structure, I try to minimize any damage I would do, and I'm focusing purely on adding that food, that organic matter to the soil, both what's turned upside down and then what I add again on top. So it's a trade-off as to the benefits of the structure, the soil structure. And so when you talk soil structure, there are a couple aspects: the soil tilth, what the soil is actually made of, and the soil nutrients. And so the soil structure has a lot of components to it. And so if you don't have all of those components, it's going to affect the structure. Well, the nutrients in the soil are actually part of a soil structure. And that's why, for me, turning it in at the end of the season is beneficial. I'm hoping at the end of another year or two that I won't need to do that every year, that my soil will be rich enough with the organic matter that I can just add the mulch, primarily compost on top, and achieve what some of you are already doing with no-dig gardening. But the soil has to have that life, and it has to have the nutrients to start with to then reach the point where you don't need to turn it anymore. And my soil just isn't at that point yet. So till we get to that point, I have to do it. So, it looks like we might have Brian Benham on. I see Jay Dixon is talking to Brian. I don't see what, there we go, Brian Benham. So Brian lives nearby, a buddy of mine. Nice to see you here. Wood chips versus sawdust. Is sawdust too compact to be used? And so sawdust can be used either as a soil amendment or as a mulch. The issue when using it as a mulch, as you know, when you put all your compost into one of your plastic totes or your trash bins, it can get compacted, especially when it gets wet. And kind of like the grass clippings that are wet grass clippings, it can create a barrier to the water and to the oxygen that the soil also needs. So I think sawdust is a great option, but I suggest you mix it. And so my buddy Steve gives me sawdust, and I don't have as much sawdust as I would necessarily like. But what I'll do, I take my blend of leaves and straw and grass, and I'll add some sawdust to that. And so it achieves the same benefit as all the other ingredients. It's organic. It protects the soil. They break down at different rates. They benefit different soil organisms. The sawdust and the leaves in particular are going to benefit the fungal action in the soil, and the straw and the grass are going to benefit the bacterial activity in the soil. And so that's another reason why I like to blend my mulches, because it really does become different food for different soil organisms. So I know you've got a ton of sawdust, and check out Brian's channel. Brian Benham has got incredible woodworking projects. I mean, incredible, beautiful. He's an artist. And so check out some of Brian's videos as well if you're at all interested in the woodworking. But I know you've got a ton of sawdust. Use it. I would just suggest that you blend it with something else to avoid that compaction, because that is the biggest issue. If you use sawdust by itself, it will compact, and it could become more of a problem than not using the sawdust at all. Okay, and Laurel says just burn it until it's charcoal. That is an option. The issue I have whenever you burn woody material like that is it has a completely different effect on the soil. It's more like biochar, where you're adding the carbon granules to your soil, which can offer benefits, but you're not getting the nutrients. You're not getting that organic breakdown to feed the soil microbes. So yeah, using it is, or burning it is an option, but it's a different result depending on whether you use it fresh where it can break down, or you use it as something that might improve the soil structure in the future. Hi, Pat. Will pine needles as mulch change the soil pH? Great question. And no, it won't actually. And so thank you for that contribution. I appreciate that. The thing about pine needles, if you measure the pH of a green pine needle, it is acidic, but so are many other plants. So is rainwater. It's acidic, and it can be one of those things to affect the plants if you used it in that state. But once pine needles dry out, they become much closer to neutral. It's the actual chemicals inside the pine needle that give it that acidity when it's on the tree. And so when it dries out, those chemicals are lost. And once those chemicals are lost, all that's left behind is the high carbon material of the pine needle, which is virtually neutral pH. So it doesn't change the soil pH. Also, just about anything you use as a mulch, whether it's neutral or alkaline or acidic, it's only affecting that very top interface between the soil and the mulch. And so dried pine needles aren't acidic, and they're not going to have that effect. But even if you were to use the green, fresh pine needles, it's really not going to change the pH of the soil. Kind of like we were talking earlier with, excuse me, with the nitrogen. It might affect in a very small layer the pH, but it's not going to affect the soil overall. And once it starts raining and once they start drying out, it's not going to have any impact on your soil at all. I like using pine needles. I use pine needles a lot. They're my preferred mulch around my strawberry plants because they take so long to break down, and they're not as chunky as the wood chips. I think they look nicer. The strawberries tend to rest on them as the strawberries are ripening. So I like pine needles. I use pine needles a lot in my pathways as a ground cover, a mulch, so that I don't have the weed growth between my beds. And so between the wood chips and the pine needles for weed suppression, that's a big reason that I'm using them. Hi, Yankee Sister. Fantastic topic. Great. Thank you for saying that. We'll watch the replay. I love mulching. Take care, everyone. Take care to you as well. Thank you for being here on Monday and watching in replay and giving me that contribution. I think it's, I'd say it every week I see you here. You make my week. So I hope you have a wonderful week, Yankee Sister. And thank you for that. And join us in the replay. And all of you can. If you're coming in late and you missed the beginning, you can always watch it on replay or go rewind and watch from the beginning, and you'll just be behind us a little bit. But thanks. Yeah, I think that's a good topic today too. And this is definitely something that I wanted to refresh us all on and maybe offer some new info. Anita is saying, do you add the 6 inches of mulch all at once or in increments over time? And when during the plant's lifetime do you put on mulch? Good question. And so it depends on the plant. It depends on the reason you're doing it. And a lot of it depends on how much mulch you have and how much time you have. So in my fruit tree mini orchard, I put it all on at once. I got loads and loads of the wood chip mulch, and I think I made, so I have a place near me where they chip up branches and then offer it as free, and you can just go pick up the wood chip mulch for free. And so I took my trailer over the course of a couple days, and I think I picked up 12 trailer loads of the wood chip mulch. And fully loaded, my trailer holds between 2 and 3 cubic yards of mulch, or of wood chips. And so that's a lot of wood chips. So I started with that, and I would get a trailer load and spread it, and get a trailer load and spread it, and get a trailer load and spread it. So I covered that whole area all at once because I wanted the 6 inches right away to cut down all the weeds because I was putting the trees in, and to help benefit the soil over time, because as the fruit trees grow, my soil is terrible. But that 6 inches of mulch that is slowly decomposing will enrich the soil underneath and make it better for the trees and for the roots to actually spread out, because of the soil moisture being raised a little bit underneath that mulch, and because I don't have a lot of other options. I don't want to be pulling a lot of weeds and amending the soil around the trees if I can put a mulch in place to achieve those same things. So a place like that, I did it all at once. In other areas of the garden, like my perennial garden area, my pollinator garden, I'm doing it in phases. Now all of the mulch is down, but as I was putting seeds in, I would wait until the seeds sprouted before I would put the mulch. The plant needs to be growing. It's easier for a seed to grow in open soil than it is to grow through mulch. So I would wait till the seeds either were growing, or I put transplants in, and then I began mulching that area lightly at first, and then increasing the amount of mulch depending on the type of plant it is. So the sturdy plants, the plants that are going to be there for a while, my perennial flowers, my perennial bushes, even my raspberries, I will add mulch over time because some of it is decomposing, it's compacting a little bit, and I need to refresh it. In my vegetable garden, when I am sowing my seeds, I'll cover with a very light layer of dried grass clippings to try to moderate the soil temperature and the soil moisture so that those seeds will germinate. Then as the plants start growing, I'll add a light layer of straw. And then as the plants get bigger, then I'll get to my blend of leaves and straw and grass clippings and maybe sawdust. And that's how I finish up the season with that blend. So as the plant grows, I add more mulch in most cases. And how much mulch I use depends on the plant. I'm aiming for 2 to 3 inches as a target throughout most of my vegetable garden, but the plant has to be at least that tall before I get to that point. And so I just added some more straw to my tomatoes this last week. My tomato plants now are roughly 18 inches tall. I'm still using a ground cover, a living mulch around most of my tomatoes. You might see that in videos to come, but it doesn't cover the entire area. Now that the tomato plants are big enough, I've added the straw mulch around the tomatoes to help with all of those benefits that the mulch adds. But in other areas of my garden, the mulch is still pretty light because the plants haven't gotten that big yet. So it depends and it varies. And so that's one of the things about mulch is that it doesn't need to be, and really shouldn't be, a one-time deal where you put mulch down at the beginning of the season and then walk away and expect that that's going to be good. You will probably need to add more as the plant grows, and especially in a region like mine with the heavy winds we get, it might blow away or it might shift. I wish I would have made a video about this. This was in the very beginning when I had made my first video and I was doing a test. And I didn't think back then that I was going to have a future YouTube channel, or else I would have shot the video all those years ago. But I did a test with the mulches. And I had one bed that was just straw, and I had one bed that was just dried grass clippings, and I had one bed that was the dried leaves, and then I had the bed where all three were mixed together. And with our winds, it's probably no surprise that the leaves, the straw, and the grass clippings blew away. They either blew off the bed or they shifted, pushed by the wind, so that some of the bed was covered with mulch and some of the bed was bare soil. But when I mixed the three together, it almost held together like they were glued together. There's still some shifting when the winds get very strong, but it holds together much, much better. And so that's why I like to use that blend as it increases or as the plants grow tall enough that I can use more mulch. And I don't like that having to redo a project. So if I'm going to add mulch, I want it to stay in place as much as possible. And that's another reason I like to use that blend, because I don't have to redo it. Idaho Gardener, thank you for that super sticker. Nice to see you here. Thanks for that contribution on this Monday morning. I hope you're benefiting from the topic of mulch. Michelle, where do you get your straw to mulch? I live in a rural area, but I've heard I shouldn't because it could have seeds in them. Good point. And so I have a couple ranch supply stores near me. And so I get them from a couple different places. I don't have loyalty to any particular store over another. And I think it's luck of the draw. And I'm wondering why this has changed so much. So 5 years ago, I never had an issue with seeds in my straw. And these last 2 years in particular, I've had a lot of seed in my straw. Nice thing about that, though, is that when that seed germinates and starts growing through the mulch helps keep the soil nice and loose and light. And so when you see a new sprout popping up through the mulch, it looks an awful lot like straw. And so you just pluck it out, put it back on the surface, and it becomes mulch again. So I have had to increase my weeding in the beds that I'm using straw in recent years, because I've noticed that there is an increase in seeds. But this is an important point to note. There's a difference between straw and hay bales. So hay is a food, and it almost always has seeds in it because seeds are nutritious for farm animals. So if you use hay as a mulch, you're pretty likely to have some of those seeds germinate. Straw is supposed to be, in most cases, depending on the type of straw, the stalks of the plants after they've harvested the seed. And so you'll have food crops like rye and wheat, where they'll come through and they'll harvest the seeds and then leave behind the stalks. Well, those stalks are what the straw bales are. I don't know if it's a change in the machinery or if they're harvesting at times when some of the smaller plants are the size of the harvester coming through. Whatever the reason, yes, I've seen more seeds in straw than in the past, but way fewer in the straw bales versus what you'll find in the hay bales. The amount of watering or the amount of weeding is really not that big a deal. And so even though I have to pull some of those weed seedlings out occasionally, I just do that. I think the benefits of using the mulch and the ease of using the straw outweigh those few weeds that I need to pull. And the weeds are straw. And so they're just adding to the layer of mulch. It's replenishing on a very slow rate, if you want to look at it that way. So, yeah, Greg, I agree with you. I have one bed that has a living mulch of bindweed. I'm sorry to hear that. Bindweed is a nemesis. I've seen it starting to crop up in a few of my beds, and I'm staying on top of it, trying to keep it from becoming a living mulch. Brian says, my perennial cover crops, creeping thyme and oregano, good choices, is nearly completely filled in my celery bed, just waiting for the same in my tomato and pepper beds. And so like I mentioned earlier with the living mulch idea, and Brian is right on, covering the soil is the goal. And getting benefit to your soil is the goal. If it's a dead material, like an organic mulch, or a living material like thyme and oregano, you can get many of the same benefits. It's totally up to you. I grow thyme and oregano not as a cover crop or as a living mulch, but it's definitely an option and definitely something to think about. And that's, like I said, that's what I'm doing in my around my tomatoes. I'm growing mostly peas and legumes to help benefit the soil around my tomatoes. But it's the same idea. It helps keep the soil covered and really is going to and currently feeding the organisms in that soil. Okay, let's see. Nice to see you here today, Tron. I don't have the translator in front of me, but nice to see another global gardener from Vietnam joining us. Rudimental gardening. I use chopped leaves for mulch from my leaf mold pile. Good choice. I don't know if you saw my video on Friday, or on Saturday, but I talk about that. Can blight or soil-borne diseases be spread from using this as mulch? I had an early blight this spring from my tomatoes. So yes and no. So many of the diseases that we have in our garden are specific to plants. And so a type of disease on a tree might not necessarily cause the same type of disease in a vegetable garden plant. There are some crossovers, and it can be a problem with some types of diseases. And so if you know you're using a contaminated material as a mulch or a compost, it's likely that you'll be contaminating an area where you would use that as a mulch or a compost. In a compost pile, if you can get the temperature extremely hot, that's why you start talking about compost piles that are above 140 degrees Celsius, or 140 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 degrees Celsius. Because when you start getting up to those high temperatures, you can kill all of the disease-causing spores or the actual bacteria that might be causing the diseases. And so that will happen in a compost pile. That won't happen if you're making leaf mold. It won't happen if you're just raking up leaves underneath a tree. You're not going to be killing anything as part of the process of making leaf mold. Now, that being said, the fungi and the bacteria that are involved with decomposition over time will neutralize a lot of those disease-causing organisms or bacteria or spores. So in time, in soil, that will dissipate. As a mulch, you're not going to have that because the mulch is on top of the soil, not in the soil. When it comes to something like blight, the spores are everywhere. So yes, they may have been on the tree leaves, but they're probably also not only on your tomato leaves, they're on the strawberry leaves, they're on your garlic leaves. It's everywhere. And so it's just a matter of when that finds the focus of that particular disease and it's looking for the tomatoes. It's not going to cause blight on garlic, but I guarantee you those spores are on your garlic plants. But when they find their way to the tomatoes, they're gonna harm the tomatoes. Another benefit of mulch is that it can reduce the risk of some soil-borne diseases. If you have nothing on your soil, every time you water, every time it rains, those water droplets are hitting the soil and then bouncing back up in very small particles. You can't always see it. But in each of those water droplets that bounces onto your plant, that is going to carry the spores, the bacteria, whatever's going to be causing those diseases. So by putting a mulch around your tomato plants and all of your plants, you're decreasing the likelihood of those soil-borne diseases, because the mulch is keeping the soil-borne diseases from bouncing up or being blown onto the plant. So this is one of those where I would not be as worried that your leaf mold is going to be spreading the disease. I would go ahead and still use it. And in fact, that's one of the uses of my leaf mold leaves, is as a mulch around my tomatoes as well, because it will be decreasing the likelihood of any contaminated soil underneath. But when it comes to something like blight, early blight or late blight, it's there. It's all around us, and you just have to keep an eye out for it. And I think mulch can actually decrease the likelihood in a lot of situations. And so hope that helps. We're talking about some of that spread. I think the benefits of mulch, even if there's a likelihood that it came from a contaminated disease source, is lessened over time as that mulch is exposed to the sun, because the UV rays can actually help you in that state, and the material in the mulch will be degraded in time from the UV rays, from the rainwater, and just because the material is going to break down, and now the soil organisms get into play and neutralize whatever that disease causing factor happens to be. Wasabi Gal, nice to see you back. We've had a lot of rain, seeing more slugs than usual. Would using cedar chips in the garden pathways deter slugs? And so slugs are one of those things, and there's some fun videos if you haven't seen some of those slug videos out there, of slugs crawling across broken glass, and slugs crawling across the copper wires, and slugs crawling across wood chips of all types. There are some materials that deter slugs, but after rain, when everything is wet, then there isn't much deterrence, because that's the mode that the slugs and the snails love. They love that wet environment. So if it's dry, then the cedar wood chips, or almost any dry wood chip, is actually going to deter slugs, because they're going to take a lot of their mucus, a lot of their internal moisture, just to crawl across that dry wood, and they're going to seek out a shady wet spot instead. So from that perspective, yes, it might be a deterrent for slugs. But after rain, or if you're watering your pathways, it's not so much of a deterrent anymore. And so keep it dry. And it doesn't have to be cedar. Any of those big chunky wood chips would help, but keeping it dry is the key component when it comes to the slugs. If it's wet, it really doesn't matter what the material is. Wet glass, the slugs can crawl right across, and it doesn't even stop them. They're traveling on their mucus and the water, and they could care less what's underneath it in most cases. So yeah, use chips on your pathways, definitely, for lots of reasons. But if you are concerned about the slugs, then they really need to be dry. Okay, let's see. Rick is saying bare soil dries up and then becomes hydrophobic and stops water penetrating into the soil, hence the goodness of mulching or cover cropping. Excellent point. And you're exactly right. And that's a big reason why I have such a thick layer of mulch around my fruit trees, because around my fruit trees, around my entire garden, my soil is extremely hydrophobic. And so most soils, when they get dry, as Rick points out, they'll actually shed the water. The water will run off rather than being absorbed. And so you could water every day, but if your soil is dry every day, that water is not soaking in, it's running off, it's evaporating. But if you can get a moist soil, as soon as that first drop of water hits the soil, it's going to be absorbed by the soil. Think about a sponge. If you buy sponges, they typically come in a little plastic container, and they already feel moist. I don't know what it is they treat them with, but they can start working right away. But if you let your sponge dry out, stick it underneath the faucet, and you'll see that the water just runs right off of the sponge until the sponge is moist and then begins absorbing the water. The soil is exactly the same way. And so the mulch helps by moderating that soil moisture, which means when you water, all of that water is getting to the soil, with the exception of what might be absorbed by the mulch. And so in a really thick mulch layer like I have to be careful, because if I just do a light watering, I'm watering the mulch. The mulch is absorbing, the dry mulch on top is absorbing the water long before it gets to the soil. So I need to soak my trees to make sure that the water is getting through the mulch and then into the soil. And we've had a couple really nice rainy days, and I'm going to go out here in a little bit and check, and I'm guessing we've had enough rain to make it through that mulch. So now the soil underneath my thick mulch should be moist and should stay moist. I saw this last year. It was incredible. So last year, end of June, beginning of July timeframe, we had some really nice thunderstorms. A lot of rain was dumped, and I checked, and that whole area with my 6 inches of wood chip mulch was moist soil. Well, periodically, I went out to check to see if I needed to water again, and it stayed moist. And I didn't water that entire area for 2 months. In August, I was going out and the soil was still moist underneath that thick layer of mulch. In the areas with lighter mulch, the soil would actually dry out faster. But that thick mulch had become enough of a barrier to that water evaporation that I didn't have to worry about it, which is why I'm doing it around my trees, which is why I say it'll benefit the soil and help the root growth. So you're exactly right. You got to keep your soil moist. And some soils are more hydrophobic than others. They'll shed the water. But most soils, when they dry out, you've got to get them moist again before they'll absorb the water that the plant needs. So, okay, let's see. Yeah, Bohemian Herbology Natural Solutions says soil next to the garden cracked and dry. Under the mulch, it's cool and moist. There you go. It works. It works. So all of those of you who have done it and are seeing it know that, but especially for new gardeners who this might be a new idea, it works. That's why you got to do it. That's why I'm doing a show today about mulch. Because if you're not doing it, you should be doing it. So while I'm thinking about it, let's go ahead and talk about the background today. This comes from Bud Jenkins, and I love this garden space. A lot of similarities to how I've set up my garden beds. And these are all raised beds. They're different sizes. Some are low, some are high. But I like this kind of garden in my vegetable garden for planting purposes, for appearance, for ease of watering. You can see the garden hose. And so this is one of those where you just drag the hose up the middle, and then you branch out to each side as you water. And so a bed like that, or a garden like this with these kind of beds, I like for ease of watering. So you're not dragging the hose across plants. The beds themselves actually become guidelines for where the hose goes. So I really like that. But you can see some grow bags back here. So obviously this is the wide pathway to be able to bring in the wheelbarrow and the tools and the hose and all of that. But on the back side, you don't need that full pathway to get through anymore. So yeah, why not throw in some grow bags back there? I think that's a great idea. And of course, the chair, being able to just sit and enjoy the garden space. So I've talked about all of these topics in the past as things I like to see in a garden, and things I like to put into a garden. So I think this is fantastic. Along this fence, you can actually see This looks like it's probably a hog panel rather than a cattle panel, but using a heavy metal trellis for these plants right here. Looks like there's some cages and other trellising in the back. If you look off to this other side, you can see these grapevines up a trellis with these T-posts and wires. And so Bud's doing a lot of different things in the garden. A lot of things probably you're doing too, but probably the main thing to identify is the fence. It's a fenced in garden. And so if you see all this, I'm not sure if that scrub oak back there, my last garden was like that, where we had a lot of scrub oak, a lot of plants. All those animals are going to come out at night and venture to see what they can find. And when they come to an area like this, especially deer, a short fence like this can actually deter deer when you use wooden raised beds like this in a garden. Because the deer only can jump a fence this short, by all means, but they're not going to jump a fence where their landing is going to be questionary. Where are they going to land? Are they going to break a leg on one of these beds? And so they're not going to jump this fence because it's too uncertain as to where the landing is going to be. And so I'm guessing Bud doesn't have a big deer problem in this garden area because this is just enough to deter the deer and a lot of the other wildlife that might be coming out of the garden or out of the trees to the garden. So really nice. And then talking about mulch today, that's a reason why I wanted to show this picture. You can see all of the pathways underneath or next to the beds, wood chips. And look for a weed. I don't see a weed on any of the pathways because the mulch is cutting down on the weeds, and it's also helping to keep, especially if you have low raised beds like this. Well, if the pathway isn't mulched, it's going to dry out and it's going to stay dry. Well, the soil underneath these beds is going to dry out quickly as well because the dry soil is going to suck out the water from the wet soil. By having mulch in between the beds and moderating the soil moisture, you're helping to keep the pathways from absorbing the water that you're putting into your garden beds. So I never hear anybody talk about it, but that's a big reason why I mulch my pathways, is so that the pathways don't suck up the water that I want my plants to be using in the garden beds. So lots of fun things to see in this picture of Bud's garden. Some easy beds, beautiful beds. You can see it's another reason why I like to use raised beds like this, because it looks like every bed has its clearly defined plants. And that's why I say it's really good for planning, because you can just pick out the space of your bed, 4 feet by 8 foot, or the size of my beds, figure out what you're going to put into those beds and then go out and do it. And it makes it really easy. So thanks for sharing that with us today, Bud. I appreciate it. And I love your garden. I think there's a lot of nice things that we can gain from what we're seeing in this area. And so out here, you've got the lawn that's being mowed. And over here, you see mulching. And like we were talking about, I'm guessing, there's probably new seeds that have gone in here. So no mulch on that part of the bed. This area where there are plants, you've got more mulch. And this looks like straw, but I bet Bud is also using a lot of grass clippings in this area as well. So there's some things to look at, maybe gain from when you get an opportunity to look at other people's gardens. And so learn from Bud. And if you want the rest of us to learn from what you're doing, send me a picture. gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. Let me know that I have your permission to use it as a backdrop, any backstory that you want to share, and I'll add it to the queue. And do try to send it in landscape rather than portrait mode. That helps out. And look forward to seeing yours in the future. Oh, there's Bud. Yeah, hey, nice to see you. I hadn't seen that you were on. And the peas in the front are ready to start picking this week. Awesome. So that's incredible. It looks like they're, well, this picture's a few weeks old, so it looks like they're getting close. So awesome. Well, thank you, Bud. I appreciate that. And like I said, there's a lot of the things I see you doing right, and good lessons to share to everybody else. So that's wonderful. Thanks for letting me use your picture today. So, okay, let's see. Good question, Luke. Use mulch in pots. Yes. And so I did a video recently where I was preparing my pots to put blueberries in. And in that video, where the video was just about preparing the soil, I actually put a mulch on top of the soil before the plants even went in, because I was trying to protect the soil microbes and the soil life before I put the plants in. Since then, I've put my blueberry plants in those pots, and I've kept the mulch in play. If you see the video I did a month or so ago where I put the columnar apple trees in pots, I mulched the pots, mulched the soil in the pots. And in smaller pots, where I might have my herbs growing, I'll use something like a dried grass clipping. I'll use a much lighter mulch in smaller pots. But if the plant is going to spread over the side of the pot, I don't worry as much about mulch, because the plant becomes its own cover of the soil. But for any plant that's going to be growing in a pot where it's like a blueberry or an apple tree where there's going to be a lot of exposed soil otherwise, then yes, I definitely mulch. And depending on what kind of plant it is, determines the mulch. So in those blueberries, the size of the pot was perfect for my pine needles. And not because they changed the pH, but because I have pine needles and it made it easy to use as a mulch in that bed. The apple trees made it real easy to use wood chips. And so I've got wood chip mulch in my big pots because those trees aren't going anywhere. I'm not doing anything to add or remove plants in those pots. And so I can use something like wood chip, which is a more permanent mulch solution. So good question. Yeah, that's definitely something I would recommend. Okay, and now we've got Peggy P says mulch is so indispensable in our dry area. Using our yard's pine needles, mulching not only my raised beds, but in my potted tomatoes and verticals. There you go. And you're doing it right, exactly. Especially in dry areas. It makes a huge difference. It really does. You know, that's one reason why I think probably we've talked more about the water in the soil and that aspect of mulch, because for many of us in dry areas, it makes all the difference in the world between having a successful garden or not. I gardened for years not knowing or fully understanding the benefits of mulch, and then watering 2 or 3 times a day, and the plants just never really did as well as I would have hoped. And I just thought that was what a new gardener did, was just suffer, and the plants suffered, and you're all constantly watering. Once I learned about mulch, it changed my world, my gardening world, because I don't have to water as often. The soil's happier, the plants are happier, and it's all because of the mulch. Pine needles, wood chips, straw, whatever, plastic, rock. If you have a landscape or a garden in a dry area, it needs to be mulched. The soil needs to be covered. It's just as simple as that. So I'm glad you're doing that. And if you haven't become a convert, I hope you will by the end of the show today. Christiane saying, why is my eggplant losing its blossoms on flowering? Stands on a sunny balcony in a big pot, got fresh potting mix with eggshell powder, and I keep it watered regularly. Could be the heat. And so when the temperature gets above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, about 32 degrees Celsius, you're going to see blossom drop. And that holds true for peppers and tomatoes and squashes and eggplants. And so if it's in a sunny location and it's near your house, I'm guessing you've had some hot days, but you also have reflective heat off of your house. And so that sunny balcony at some time during the day, even if your air temperature is not above 90 degrees, the heat of the pot and the air around the plant might exceed 90 degrees because of just that thermal radiation, the sun bouncing off your house, the hot air, add in a little bit of wind, and you're going to have blossom drop. That would be my best guess in this situation. This is where shade cloth comes in, or something to help block the sun. So start looking closely at your eggplant and note if there are certain times of the day that the sun is particularly intense, and when it's bouncing off the side of your house and raising the overall temperature in the area, and put up something. You can put up a sheet, you can put up a tarp, build a little wall, get some shade cloth, something to help cut down on the amount of sun during that critical time. And I'm guessing you'll see some of those flowers actually get to the point that they'll pollinate and turn into fruit. That is one of those problems with growing on a balcony or a deck, is that in pots, it can get hotter than the plant likes to pollinate, and then you won't get the fruit. So that's probably the biggest reason. It could also be a lack of pollinators. And so there's a very short period where the flowers can be pollinated. And if they're not pollinated, the flowers will drop off. And so they'll open and the flowers will be ready. And for some plants, it's only a couple hours. Other plants, maybe a full day, depends on the plant. But if you don't have a lot of pollinators flying around and helping out, you're going to see the blossom drop because the plants weren't pollinated. So that could be an issue. Not as big an issue with plants like peppers and tomatoes and eggplants, but if you have a problem with, more so in squashes where the blossoms are dropping or that little fruit shrivels up, it's because it wasn't pollinated. So it's falling off the plant so that the plant can put more energy into more flowers that maybe will pollinate in the future. So do a little investigative work and stand out and look at the sun and look for pollinators and see if that might give you a little more definite answer on what's happening. And so SC's asking, what is the best live mulch and how do we apply compost if the live mulch covers it all? And so lots of options for live mulch. And so I've actually seen some things recently. Clover is a really nice living mulch. Clover actually can introduce nitrogen into the soil. It doesn't interfere a lot with deep-rooted plants. It tends to be more shallow-rooted, and it grows and covers an entire area. So clover is a nice option. I've got, like I mentioned, peas, Austrian peas are one that I've used in my area. Lots of other variations of grasses that you can find in cover crop mixes. Those can all be options. So much depends on your climate, what kind of plants you like, but most cover crop plants that stay low are good options. And so that's why oregano and thyme that Brian mentioned earlier can be good options, because they tend to stay as low plants and your bigger plants will grow right through them. That's kind of what you want to look for. And when it comes to compost, I just put compost on top of the living mulch. And so I just did this recently, in fact, on my tomatoes, where the living mulch, those cover crops were growing when I put my tomatoes in. And then I wanted to add some of that rough compost. I still have more to add. I only did it in a couple areas. And you just spread it on top of those plants. And then I go in with my gloved hand and just kind of shake across the plants so that the compost falls through the plants into the soil below. So you can do that as a light covering. And then at the end of the season, you can turn everything upside down if you choose, or depending on the type of plant, you can just cut it off and it'll die. Some are perennial and come back. Depends on, again, what plant you're using, whether you cut it off, turn it in, or just let it die back in the winter. Depends on the type of plant. But yeah, look into clover. I think I'm going to start using clover a little more in a lot of areas that I have more space and more soil than the plants that will be growing in that area, and clover's one of those plants I'm going to be moving to more and more. At least that's my plan. But the idea of using a plant as a mulch is a good one, and so one of the nice things about using something like oregano is it serves dual purpose. You can still harvest it and use it in the kitchen. Now, times like a creeping thyme is not necessarily the same as a culinary thyme, and so the thyme I use, the thyme that I use for the kitchen is a plant. It's a bush. It's not the creeping thyme, but you can still do something like that. The creeping thyme, just recognize it doesn't serve the same purpose as something like an oregano that will spread across, and you can still harvest it and use it in the kitchen. Hi, KT. I'm trying to get my grass to be weed free and put down a pre-emergent and lime, and next we'll be putting down weed and feed. So does that mean I can't use grass clippings as a mulch? So not necessarily. And as I mentioned before with the straw, it depends on the chemical. So take a look at what you're using in the ingredient list, and either on the label, and some of those labels can be pages long on the back of the bottle, or go online to find out more about the chemical and find out what the half-life of that herbicide is. And that will give you an idea, because there are a lot of those type of herbicides that only have a half-life of like 3 months. And so that means after 6 months, you can use it worry-free. The chemical will have dissipated or degraded to the point that it's no longer hazardous. And so you can still cut the grass. You just need to store it for 6 months before you can use it. Or if it's got a half-life of 6 months, store it for, like, cut it in 1 year and put it in a trash container for the winter, and then use it the next year after those chemicals have dissipated. So you can still use it, but it depends on how soon you can use it based on what the chemicals are in that product that you're using. Same with adding it to a compost pile. You can add it to a compost pile, and the microbes in the compost pile will actually help break down a lot of those herbicides as well. I would use aged grass clippings in a compost pile, because some of those chemicals can affect the microbes in your compost pile. But put old grass clippings in your compost pile, and then let the microbes finish up and get rid of anything that remains, and then you could use the compost as an amendment or as a mulch. And that could be a way to not have to throw away the bags of grass. That's one of those things, sending grass to a landfill if you can use it in your own garden. I think that's the worst option. Try to figure out a way to use it in your garden rather than send it to a landfill. So I'm glad that you're asking that question, because I think you can use it, just might be amount of time. Terry says, I have 2 Roma tomato plants in 10-gallon grow bags, about 4 feet tall with very few blossoms and no tomatoes. What can I do to encourage growth? So I have to ask about your soil to start with. If you're using a potting mix that has fertilizer added, how much nitrogen is in that? The excess nitrogen that often happens in a potting mix, especially after we add fertilizer. You use a potting mix that has fertilizer in it in a grow bag or in a pot, and then we're told you're supposed to fertilize. So now you add more fertilizer to that potting mix that already had fertilizer in it. And if the nitrogen gets too high, then you're going to have tomato plants that look great, and they're going to keep growing great, and they're not going to be putting out the blossoms. So that's my first question to you is, do you possibly have too much nitrogen, which is cutting down on the flowers? If that's the case, stop fertilizing. Don't add any more fertilizer to that mix and to that soil, and the plants should recover, and you should start getting blossoms and fruit. The weather, temperature is also a factor. If you've been encountering some of those very hot conditions that we've been talking about, then that can affect the blossoms as well. So if you can move those grow bags during the heat of the day, put them in the shade, or construct a little wall or barrier with shade cloth to try to give them shade during the hottest part of the day. And that might also give you a few extra blossoms and some extra fruit. So again, two most likely reasons for not enough flowers or the flowers dropping in tomatoes is too much nitrogen fertilizer or dry, hot, windy conditions, and the flowers just aren't going to grow and give you fruit in those conditions. So if they're already 4 feet tall and looking okay, it may not necessarily be the growth of the plant that you need to encourage. It's the flowers and the heat around the plant that you may need to modify, and probably avoid the fertilizers. So I want to point out my shirt today. Not sure if you noticed it. I'm wearing my Risky Biscuit Hayseed Hoot shirt. And I actually put a link in the description below to the Risky Biscuit Hayseed Hoot, which is a radio show that's been around for more than 30 years. And my buddy, Dondo DeRue, is the host of that show, and he has been for decades. I knew Don way back when. Don is probably my oldest friend. We were debate partners in high school. We were roommates in college. I went into the Air Force, and he went into radio broadcasting. And he now has his own show. It's a weekly show, the Risky Biscuit Hayseed Hoot. It's primarily Western music, and that's a little bit different than country music. It's folk music, and it's just good down-home American music. It's something you can stream, and it's something that I support by getting my Risky Biscuit Hayseed Hoot shirt, and I've got a Risky Biscuit Hayseed Hoot mug. But the reason I wanted to bring this up, not only because I support Dondo and what he's doing on the radio show, but to highlight that it was 40, almost 45 years ago, that, well, longer than that, getting closer to 48 years, I guess, that I first met Don, and we became friends. And of course, we moved on to become very good friends, roommates, the whole bit. And then when we went our separate ways, we lost touch with each other, which often happens with those friends in your younger years. And it's been relatively recently that we've reconnected again. And one of the things that allowed our reconnection, you guessed it, gardening. I have my YouTube channel. Don is interested in gardening. He kind of discovered me that way. I discovered him through the Risky Biscuit Hayseed Hoot, and we now correspond occasionally and find out what each other is doing in our lives. A couple weeks ago, Don actually had a garden show. His weekly show was all gardening music, or music about gardens, and he gave me a really great shout out in his radio broadcast. And I just, I'm so thankful for Don being back in my life, but also because Don, in his old age, like me, has found that gardening is one of those things that just makes us feel better. It helps us connect with others. And he's recognized and is recognizing more and more the importance of gardening, not only in his own life, but in the life of others. And so to have a 2-hour radio show dedicated to gardening, I think is just fantastic. And that's why I wanted to talk about Dondo DeRue and the Risky Biscuit Hayseed Hoot. And And he has different themes every week. The gardening show is typically an annual thing he does. But isn't that fantastic? Not only to reconnect with old friends, but in that old age, after all those years apart, to recognize that you both have that interest in gardening and you recognize the importance, particularly going into old age, of gardening. And so check out the Risky Biscuit Hayseed Hoot. Click on the link in the description below, and it's a different show. It's not the kind of music that most of us hear on the radio, because Don puts his heart and soul into his show and chooses the music, songs you've never heard before, and occasionally throws in one that you have. But it's interesting music. And I like it. His show comes out on Saturdays. I like to listen to the music, you guessed it, in the garden. So when the show comes out on Saturdays, regardless of what the theme is for the week, I listen to my old buddy Don DeRue and listen to some interesting, unique, almost always calming music, perfect for gardening. And I just wanted to share that with you today, because it's one of those things. I have many of you that tell me you listen to this live stream when you're in the garden, because of not only the lessons, but because it's calming. And if you can find that music that also adds to your gardening experience, I think that's a wonderful option as well. So check out the Risky Biscuit Hayseed Hoot. It may lighten up your day. It'll definitely make your gardening experience a little different, and I hope better, and definitely has for me. James Richter, thank you so much for that contribution. Thank you, audience and moderators, for the advice, and thank you for that. And thank you, all of you. Mondays are just about my favorite gardening time, when I'm not actually in the garden. And so all of you globally, on replay or live right now, thanks for being here. I hope you have a great week. Next Monday is the 4th of July here in the United States. It's a holiday, but I'll be here. I'll be back. Hopefully more of you will be here live if you take some time out of your activities on the 4th to join us in this wonderful community. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.